All right, everybody, it is time to get this show started. It's 12 o'clock on Wednesday, which means it's time for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Welcome, everybody. My name is Chris Smith, and I am your host every week for the Lunchtime Discovery Series, brought to you by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education, that's within the Department of Environmental Quality, and us here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, which is within the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. It's good to be with you all again this week. We've got a great program for you. We're going to be hearing from a very special guest, somebody that I am almost entirely 100% certain that you're going to enjoy learning from today. And we've got a pretty cool and interesting topic today. Normally we're meeting like scientists who are talking about their research or artists. Today we're actually going to be hearing from someone whose job it is to take that science themed art, or to take that science itself and make it presentable to, well, people like us, people who enjoy learning about it, reading about it, watching, and somebody who is skilled across, at least in my experience, seeing them work, so many different mediums, skilled writer, video producer, director, person on Twitter, all of the above. Michelle Jewell does a fantastic job. Michelle is a science communicator at North Carolina State University's Department of Applied Ecology, and Michelle joins us for the program today. Hey, Michelle.
Hey, Chris. Thank you so much for all of that. I didn't know I did so much, actually. So that's, thank you.
Well, I hope I got it right.
Yes.
Did I add all around great person into your introduction?
Thanks, Chris. So how's it going over on, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I was going to remind everybody that I'm not the only person that gets to talk to Michelle today. Everybody watching the program gets to talk to you. Folks, you can do that by dropping your questions, thoughts, comments, and experiences into the chat box if you're watching on YouTube, and into the comments if you're watching on the museum's Facebook page. So throughout the program, we're going to want you to be engaged and leaving your thoughts. I'll be moderating and taking your thoughts from those places and sharing them over to Michelle. So make sure you're filling up the chat as I go throughout the program. But Michelle, I interrupted you, and you're the guest today.
No, I was just about to ask you, how you doing over there?
I'm doing pretty good. Today's actually a very special day for me personally and professionally. It's kind of hard to tell, but I'm broadcasting from inside the museum's broadcasting studio. So like the lights, the mics, all of that. And I broke down my work from home museum studio today, which folks might be familiar with. It had like the desk and the tables and the stuff in the background. All of that is now here at the museum. And so very soon I'm going to be building a new studio right here, which is fun.
Awesome. Congratulations. I am within the studio of my office space with the sun and my trusty green screen. So I'm also feeling pretty professional today. It's a weird feeling after these 18 months.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it looks fabulous. Sounds fabulous.
Great.
And I'm excited to hear what you've got for us today.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'll crack on if you'd like. Let me just go ahead, and I've got a few different machines here. So let's see.
I can ask you how the weather is over on your side of Raleigh.
Sunny, warm, a little humid today. This September humidity sneaks up on you, doesn't it? Like you look at your phone and you're like, oh, 74, that's fine. Oh, but it still hits you like a ton of bricks. Okay.
'Tis the season of layers.
Oh, let me present there, buddy. Okay, hold on. We were all good until like this very moment.
I'm going to see how the folks over in our chat are doing. Folks, don't forget, let me know like where you're watching the program from too. We love to see where in North Carolina or beyond you're tuning into today's program. And you can also tweet along with the show. The Office of Environmental Education folks are on Twitter at North Carolina EE. You can follow them and follow the hashtag Lunchtime Discovery in order to participate in this program. And we would love for you to grab screenshots, share your thoughts on Twitter with us as well. We've got folks from all over actually in the chat right now.
How far away? How far away?
Let's see here. I think the farthest. Oh my gosh. Okay, we have somebody watching from Freiburg, Locum, Germany.
Yes. Welcome, Germany.
Hey, Jens. We've got folks from Washington, NC, Durham. Oh, hey, Max Colley's here.
Yay, Max.
Hey, Max. All right, looks like the slides are up and working.
Yep, thank goodness.
I'm gonna hush.
The internet came through right at the buzzer here. Okay, Chris, again, thank you so much for having me. The whole team at the Museum of Natural Sciences, the North Carolina Double E's, thank you so much for having me here. I was just saying to Chris that I've been a longtime listener, first-time caller. This is my first talk for this Lunchtime Discovery series, and I greatly appreciate your time. As you might imagine, if you know anything about me, I'd like to take a little bit of a different approach to this talk. Instead of having one long chunk of me speaking, I'll be breaking up this talk into sections, allowing some time for discussion at the end of each section. And we'll have a Q&A discussion at the end as well. I'll do my best to warn you as I'm approaching the end of each section. But as Chris mentioned, throw your stream of consciousness into the chat as you have it, so we can come back to it at the end of each section too. The first few sections of my talk are going to be building up a background about what science communication is and how we as humans evaluate who to trust online. And then I'll jump into some examples of folks who have and are doing this kind of guerrilla science communication work. So first, internet, come on, you can do it. Oh, yes, okay. Let's distinguish academic versus Cycom, which is a shorter way of saying science communication. These are two ways of communicating science, and they're equally important to each other. This is not going to be a talk where I'm going to slam academic sciences and put Cycom on a pedestal. Let's talk about the differences between them and their strengths and their weaknesses. Yes, okay. On the left, we have some examples of traditional academic communication. Those are your manuscripts, your peer-reviewed articles, theses, conference talks. You'll notice that each of these forms has a pretty unique theme, right? They all have very strict formatting, their calculation. And as I teach to my class at NC State, this strict calculation of these formats is critical because a core tenet of science is for its ability to be reproduced. So too then must be our ability to report it. This form is important for the process, but this kind of strict calculus isn't very compelling, and it's not very good storytelling. These forms are also largely and purposefully inaccessible by either literal paywalls or jargon barriers, right? On the right-hand side, we have examples of Cycom. That's your podcasts, popular science articles like those you might see on National Geographic or The Scientist, op-eds, books, TV interviews, the list goes on. These forms are valued for their creativity and their subjectivity to that particular audience. In many ways, that means that they're antithetical, right, to the academic stuff on the left-hand side. A Cycom piece cannot be easily reproduced, and they're made to be easily accessible. Cycom is reliant on the findings of academic researchers, but if we hope for our research to have any impact whatsoever, then it's got to have reach. And this is where Cycom outlets really outweigh academic. They are also easier to trust because they are easy to access. So let me ask you this, and you can throw some responses in the chat, and Chris, feel free to shout out a few as they come in. Which are you more likely to believe? The lived experience of an influential scientist as detailed personally on their Instagram account, or a research article that I can read for the low, low price of $8.99? Take a minute to think about it. Rate the article.
And I have some thoughts about it.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, chime in.
Well, I as a person on the internet,
yes,
I probably pay more attention to the Instagrams, and I work for the government, so I don't have $99 to drop on a journal article.
Hello. Thank you. Yeah, and the article way of us thinking about it almost kind of sounds like a pyramid scheme if you're not part of the academic space, right? Like it sounds like a scam. And let me ask you this one too, and Chris, chime in. What are you more likely to encounter, right? Decades of data detailing the decline of polar bears sitting at a bus stop, or a compelling image like the one on the right on Facebook? You're definitely going to see that polar bear. You've probably seen it sometime. And the impact is for the person who's not directly studying polar bears, the impact's the same, whether you have a notebook full of this data or you see this picture. Today, many people from all ends of the demographic spectrums seek out their news from social media. And social media being the largest and most easily accessible outlet of all. Here are some graphics from the latest research from Pew Trust. This was actually published last week. The left shows us the demographics of adults, US adults, that regularly get their news from these platforms. And there's a lot to digest here, so go ahead and take a look at that left graphic and see where you fall into it, if you do get your news from some of these things. And see how accurate it might be for yourself. For me, it is totally accurate. I am 100% a Twitter, like I get most of my news, I think, from Twitter. And then maybe a little, I'm sliding into the TikTok space as well, which you can see on the graphic is like, we're getting there, my age group. How about you, Chris? Do you see yourself in here?
Represented 110%.
Right.
except for TikTok. I haven't jumped into that space yet.
Mate,
but some folks in the chat also made some interesting observations that, for example, we're talking about scientists online, that it depends on the researcher, how likely are they spitballing stuff out into the web.
Yes.
So that you would want to pay attention to also. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm going to get in we're going to get into that a little bit, because I think one of the biggest challenges scientists face when it comes to science communication, let me take a step back. I feel like there's two kind of versions of science communicators, right? Chris, there's like people like us who are working for, a museum, a department, where our job is to spread, the sermon of the science that's happening in our areas. And then you have the scientists who are focused, on their lane, their research, their ideas, their colleagues' ideas. And what we're going to see later in the talk is some techniques that guerrilla scientists themselves are using that I think we could learn from, so that you're not trying to spread yourself a little bit too thin when it comes to getting out there. Because you might look at this as a scientist interested in science communication and say, that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're on 8 different platforms. How do you manage 8 different platforms? And spoiler alert, you don't. So, and then here on the right-hand side, just to jump back into the slides here, you can see how the US adult users to each platform, how many of them get their news regularly from that platform. So for example, the 66% of US adults who get their news from Facebook, about 31% regularly get their news from there. That's like just a little bit less than a third. And this trend of seeking news from social media is going up. Last time Pew released this type of data, it was a little bit less, but the growth is real, and it doesn't surprise me at all. And before you start to feel the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and then think that this reliance on social media is bad news, let me tell you that this is a tale as old as time. We just have very different platforms now. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story here. In the early 1900s, there was a new, terrifying platform that was also, and I quote here, threatening democracy. And it was, drum roll please, the radio. Remember this? Probably not. But when the radio came out, it was available commercially after World War I. And in 1929, the Forum published this set of contrary essays. The one on the left being by Woodford, who was opposed to radio, and Harbord, who was in favor of the radio on the right. And while many of Woodford's critiques are obviously dated, including his tirade against, and I'm going to quote here again because it's great, the rattle and band of incredibly frightful jazz music, many of his comments are relevant to the debate on the merits of social media today. Quoting again, "Thus dies the art of conversation," he finished with one of his paragraphs when he was talking about how people sipped their gin and water, sat next to a radio, not even speaking to each other. He predicted that radio would die out in 2 years, and he delightfully described the headstone that would hang over radio's handsome mound that would read, quote, "Killed by advertising," right? You can see the similarities. Harbord, on the other hand, described radio as the only means of instantaneous, general communication yet devised by man. He attributed the larger voter turnout in the 1928 presidential election, which was Hoover versus Smith, to the broadcast of candidate speeches. Harbord said, "Listeners are free from the contagion of the crowd, and only the logic of the issue what the orator presents can move him." Oh, powerful stuff. So public trust has always flowed to the formats that could be accessed easily. And that flow, those changes, have always been criticized too. Now, of course, there are differences, right? I don't want to say radio is exactly like social media. You didn't have to sell off all your personal information to listen to the radio back then, but that's another soapbox for another talk. Again, here we're talking about access to information. And easy access is what begets the reach, how far that information can go. And it creates a space for our next topic, which is going to be building trust. So Chris, I'll pause here if anybody has anything that they want to throw out there. Or Chris, your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so there are some thoughts in here. Will wrote about money for the journal articles not going to researchers.
Of course.
Yeah. But maybe slightly more on point with talking about communication. Lee writes that journal articles can be accessed at libraries in person or virtually, while social media is more accessible. It is full of speculative information as well.
Right. And that was 100%. I encourage you to look up these essays from the forum. Woodford said the exact same stuff. He was like, anybody can get on the radio and say whatever they want. So the critiques are the same. The critiques of these formats are definitely the same. And there was a really powerful, I'm going to forget it because that's just how my brain works. But recently on NPR, there was a really powerful expose about how some of the op-eds that had been put out in this really important newspaper were written by oil executives for a really long time, right, to make the case for petrol. So I hear you. Like there are definitely sources available that can say whatever they want. Is that unique to social media? No. Is it louder on social media? Maybe. Are there more voices? Definitely, because anybody can post something. But yeah, these are comments that have stood the test of time when it comes to different platforms.
All right, and then we've got let's see. Jen's right. They said these things again for TV,
yeah,
and for internet chats, and now for social media, like you're saying.
Yeah, AOL chat. Could you believe anything anybody said in there? I don't think so. MSN chat? Mm-mm. No, but being able to, and I'm going to talk about this just now when we come to building trust, where we how we decide who we're going to trust is a really important topic. So maybe that's a good segue to hop into the next bit of it, Chris, unless there's another burning comment there.
Well, there's a couple of interesting comments that just rolled in talking about the discussion on Lee writes the degradation of some of these things with open access journals, yet again, a degradation in the rigor of peer review, I think being leveled as a complaint against open access.
Okay.
And then we might be able to have an interesting conversation. This one might be from later about the idea of being verified on social media.
Yeah. Oh, hang on to that one. We're coming to it.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm still trying to get verified, man. I don't know who at Twitter I got to talk to. Anyway, but that's another great segue. I'm gonna take it and run with it about how we build trust. And again, as you might imagine, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story, and I want you to see yourself in this story as well. So, okay, you've just moved to a brand new city. Okay, maybe they speak a different language in the city as well. You go to drive to work, and then you hear a loud, unmistakable cranking and grinding. It sounds expensive. So you pull out your phone and you find the two closest mechanics. And here's where I'd like to have another little bit of audience participation here, Chris. I'm gonna ask you all to look at these two and tell us in the chat, who would you trust more based on just these two mechanics? Say they're the only two mechanics in the city. You only have these two to go with. You only have this information. Which of these two mechanics would you trust?
Okay, folks, drop your thoughts there in the chat, A or B.
A or B.
Okay, right now everybody's saying that they're going with mechanic B in this case. It depends on how bad the sound is and which one is closer.
Right. Mechanics are not allowed to answer this question, by the way. If you know if you know anything about cars, this does not relate to you.
So far, there's a dozen answers for mechanic B.
Okay.
No votes for mechanic A.
No votes for mechanic A. He's got 5 stars. Okay. So there's something here about mechanic B that's more trustworthy than our mechanic A, even though he's got a full 5-star review and our mechanic B has 4.9. So you're a logical person, right? So you've looked at your phone, you see these two mechanics, but you also want to reach out to some of your friends. So you ask them for their advice. You ask a friend who has a classic car. Surely they've had lots of car problems and they could probably recommend a good mechanic. You also ask friends that have your same model car. Maybe they've had the same issue. So what is it really that between the reviews and your friend's advice, what is this measurable thing that we're actually looking for when it comes to putting our trust into somebody when we're facing a crisis? And I'm going to steal a term from every online marketing course and every MBA who's in the audience knows it, but it's called earned clout. You are seeking out who has the most earned clout, who has the most other people recognizing that person as the authority on that issue. And why are you looking for earned clout? Well, because the stakes are incredibly high, it sounds expensive, and your knowledge of the threat is probably really low. Also, you need it fixed now. You don't have time to figure out and do the research. You need to be sure that you're working with an expert, and earned clout cannot be faked. It's not something that you can buy, but will not easily buy. Earned clout's even more important than traditional forms of expertise that we might be thinking about, or expertise signaling. Even if I went back and I told you that mechanic A, the one with the 1 5-star review, say I told you that they had a PhD in cranks and clanks, but still the majority of you would probably put your trust in B. It's because that their experience has led to more work, which has led to more reviews, which has given them higher clout, which has given them more business, which leads to more work, more reviews, higher clout. He has been through this process in time several times. And the etymology of expert is to try, and we can clearly see that most of our mechanics trials, mechanic B, have been successful. So back to the story, okay? It turns out that your car, the issue is that you haven't changed your oil in like 10 years. And your engine parts are starting to warp by the excess heat because the oil can't take it away. This could have easily been prevented if you had taken some manageable small actions beforehand, but you didn't. So now you're in a crisis. And that is exactly how humans work. I hope you can see where I'm going with this. And as I come to my last slide when it comes to earn clout, and before we pause for another brief discussion, so put your comments in, let's take another look at this rating. The fact that our mechanic had a 4.9 counterintuitively increases our trust. If the mechanic had 910 reviews that were all 5 stars, what would you think? They were lies. You would think that they were bought. You would think that they were, the mechanic was a liar. You would immediately reject it. So this is very important for those of you who are in science communication, for those of you thinking about going into science communication. You need a few bad reviews to build clout too. Don't be afraid of that. I want you to think about your process too during other smaller crises in your life. You've likely placed your trust in those who already have clout in your eyes or others, usually relying on the advice of your friends or family, etc., because you don't have the time to do that much research immediately. Think back to our story. I mean, when you move to a new city, how often do you sit back and research a mechanic, right? As soon as you get there, you don't. You don't think about these things until you need to. So how do we build that clout? That's where I'm going to segue into the discussion that we all finally came for, which is the guerrilla science communicators and how they do it themselves. So again, we'll pause briefly. Chris, let me know what's in the chat.
So first off, Pam, sorry. Pam did vote for mechanic A.
It's okay, Pam.
But maybe Pam knows proficient auto mechanics on Capitol Boulevard. Let's see. There's a comment here that says, I think this idea is very interesting and can possibly lead to a permanent divide because the ones with the most clout will continue to have it and the ones without clout will never be able to earn it.
Yeah, it can seem really intimidating. But I hope this clears up. We'll come back to this after the section if the next thing I'm about to say doesn't clear that up. But yeah, I hear you on that. I hear you.
All right, excellent.
Okay, so let's think about it here. How does new knowledge become part of the status quo? Like how, for example, do we all know to drink milk after eating a chili? Hopefully you know that. There are always new bits of information or discoveries that enter whatever platform is fashionable at the time, radio, social media, Facebook. Usually that new knowledge enters the population like this red paint. It impacts the people closest to the topic, but it doesn't spread very far. And in most cases, knowledge really doesn't need to spread that far, right? If we don't need to know about every single bit of new information. Usually this works just fine. But when new knowledge challenges the status quo, and this especially seems to be the case during a crisis, we act very differently. And that means we need to communicate things differently as well. The knowledge comes in just like before, but this time we couple it with small scale limited actions, which is the mixing, in the buckets or the communities that need it the most. And this mixer is the role of the guerrilla science communicators. They're the ones who are regularly and actively working to fold in that new knowledge to the status quo. And the most effective communicators during a crisis are the ones who have already earned their clout beforehand. And here are a few examples. Again, let's launch into story time. Some people you're going to recognize, but maybe the stories you don't fully know. The first maybe second most recognizable one. Okay. Most of you'll know the science communicator on the left as author and mother of the environmental movement, Rachel Carson. You may know of her seminal work on Silent Spring, but you may not know that this was just another step in her career of clout building. Carson was always a gifted writer, and she published in children's magazines even during her high school days. After her master's, she worked as a communication specialist at what would eventually become the Fisheries and Wildlife Service. And there she wrote brochures, pamphlets, radio scripts, Basically, she was the social media manager of her time. And she also authored countless newspaper and magazine articles external to her work at the service. She then became the editor-in-chief of the Fisheries and Wildlife and worked on a pamphlet series called Conservation in Action. And the project was well received outside of the service, but it was largely criticized within it. And it was criticized for being, quote, too good. Author and historian William Souter said, quote, on several occasions, she was advised to take things that she had written and do something else with them because her supervisors thought that the government really didn't deserve the kind of literature she was producing. She was setting the bar way too high for your park pamphlet. So then she fairly understandably left Fisheries and Wildlife Service and focused on her work as an author. Her book, The Sea Around Us, started as a collection of essays that was then published in 1951, and it won several awards, already making her a fairly well-known household name in those households that valued nature. And then Silent Spring came out in 1962. It too was another series of articles that came together as a book for Carson. And while the impact was revolutionary and something that we learn about in basically every ecology class you've ever taken or biology class, for Carson, the Communicator, the format of writing essays was her bread and butter. There was no stretch here. That was her lane. Silent Spring contained new knowledge that ran completely against the status quo that DDT was a safe and God-sent chemical, which meant that this knowledge would not be accepted by some, and that some of that white paint in the mixing drum would resist being mixed. As you may expect, Carson came under fire, and this is something that we're going to see in all of our science communicators I'm going to talk about. She was called a fanatic, quote, and, quote, probably a communist. But the most infamous critique came from Dr. William J Darby from Vanderbilt University. His review of Silent Spring, titled Silence Miss Carson, was published in the Chemical and Engineering News, and it stated, and I quote, in view of her scientific qualifications, in contrast of those of our distinguished scientific leaders and statesmen, this book should be ignored. Which means he was laying it on a bit thick with degree bias there, since Carson only had a master's. Dr. Darby also used several coded kind of dog whistle terms to describe her work, like high-pitched, dramatic, and emotional. And while the attack surely landed with probably his colleagues, they fell pretty flat in the general public because Carson, due to her decades of earned clout, think all the way back, writing, magazine articles in children's magazines, to every single pamphlet you've seen at a park, to all of these other news articles, et cetera, et cetera. She had decades of clout and was already highly regarded as a sensible environmentalist when those critiques came out. And after Silent Spring was published in 1962, and this part of the story really touches me. It was actually a part that I didn't know about. It was published in 1962. Carson testified here before Congress on June 4th, 1963. And at the time of this photograph, she knew that she was terminally ill with breast cancer. And Carson died less than a year later on April 14th, 1964. The EPA was established in 1970, and DDT was banned in widespread use in the USA in 1972. So while she never lived to see the impact of her work, she did begin to see its reach. I'm going to pause there maybe, Chris, and see if there's any, before I jump into a few more examples, if there's any thoughts and comments there.
Let me take a look here. There's an interesting comment about how people experience science, which might have kind of a parallel to the story you just told, because one of our viewers writes that people seem to experience science in places that get linked up with bad experiences, like school, hospitals, or in advertisements, perhaps rather than from the sources that they really trust or people they admire, like a Rachel Carson, for example.
Yeah, or Chris Smith. I've got a solution to that too. And
then there's a response too in the chat, which I appreciate. It says, why would school be a bad environment? because in my view, it depends on how much clout the school or teacher has for the pupil. So yeah, the forms and manners and vehicles that people receive scientific information and the people that they receive it from seems to have a really big impact.
Massive impact, yeah. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later about what I think we can do to invest in those spaces, so that it becomes a inviting thing to participate in, and not the opposite of that.
Right.
Any other comments before I move on to another one?
There's a little bit of delay between our YouTube stream and our Zoom call. So it could take folks just a second to get in here. But yeah, we're starting to have a nice little conversation about science teaching in school and people's experience with that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, okay. All right. That follows nicely. Keep that conversation going. While I jump into the second of my third, Guerrilla, science communicators here. And the reason I use the term guerrilla is, again, Rachel Carson stuck to writing. That is what she was good at. That's what she enjoyed. That was her thing, and Silent Spring, again, it was a huge impactful thing for us, but it was just classic Carson. It was a series of essays came together as a book and had this huge impact. When we think about these texts, it's almost like we assume that they knew the impact of this thing going forward. But really, when you look at the history of these folks, it was just what they did. And it struck at the time that it needed to. All right, so moving on to the next one. Kind of an interesting take on this one. This was an example I actually saw on Twitter, where I get all of my news. But this was a science communicator named Marianne Lavoisier. She was wife of Anton Laurent Lavoisier. And together, they discovered the important role oxygen played during combustion. And again, that's a status quo idea, right? That you need oxygen for fire or combustion, that we take for granted today. But at the time, that was totally against status quo. It was a complete blow up dramatically about who do these people think they are coming up with this. Her talents, her lane in all of this was artistry. She was an illustrator. And descriptions of their experiments have even largely vanished, right? But her illustrations to this day have persevered, and people have based a lot of their future experiments looking at these types of diagrams. Now, she too was very much insulted and very threatened, but at this time, the threats came from the French revolutionaries. Keep in mind, science back then, when we're talking in the 1700s, was considered a noble pursuit, and we use that term differently than how they used to. Noble as in for nobility to do, not something for your average everyday person. Even the painting on the left was altered to make her appear less rich before it was displayed. She used to have a elegant hat on, and there was a lot of other expensive stuff laying around, and they removed that so that the painting wouldn't get attacked by the French revolutionaries. Nonetheless, her husband and father were actually executed by guillotine in 1794, and she was left out of that. Thank goodness. Afterwards, she went on and published a lot of information, but again, as I said, it's really her artistry that's stood the test of time. And lastly, a quick one that I'll touch on, somebody who I will say that this person, I will say this with 100% confidence. I think let me go a little bit lower since I'm giving 100% confidence. Let me say 98% of the people in the United States probably recognize the science communicator and have probably seen him in the past month or so on any TV, any radio, any social media form. And that, of course, is Anthony Fauci. And long before being kind of the steady hand in COVID-19 of understanding viruses when they get aerosoled, Fauci was a leading researcher during the HIV and AIDS epidemic too. And he was a with criticism, he was considered a really important community organizer. And that's been his lane, has been getting out there and speaking. He too was attacked then in the 80s by leading AIDS activist Larry Kramer. Kramer called him an incompetent idiot and a pill pusher, only for Kramer decades later to come around and cite Fauci as, I quote, the only true and great hero in the government during that crisis. So he, again, sticking to his lane throughout that epidemic, swine flu, and the rest. He's always been a committed speaker and community organizing person. And I obviously don't need to explain to you how he's attacked today. You can literally go on Facebook and see. So again, the similarities across all three of these researchers is that they've stuck to their lane, the things that they enjoy doing, and have communicated their science in that way. Like the mechanic, most of their career, unbeknownst to them, right? It's just what they do, has been spent building this type of clout. And like the mechanic, they have that one format of communication that they enjoy the most. And this is an important point. It's something that I always tell scientists, and I'd like to speak to the scientists or science communicators in the audience. Don't try and do everything. That is not your role if you're a scientist or science communicator. Find the outlet you enjoy the most and stick with that. So if you're a drummer, for example, be a Cycom drummer. If you're a painter, paint it. If you dance it, dance it. If you speak it. Find that thing and then just carry on with it. Put it out there, because you never know when your time is gonna actually come. And lastly, something that I wish we talked more in this field of science communication about, the expectations that we can build in this type of career. You can see in all three of our examples, they get bad reviews, right? They get criticized. Anytime that you are presenting new knowledge that runs against what people consider general knowledge, you're going to get detractors. And it's just a part of the process. And think of Galileo, right? What happened to him? There's countless examples of how this plays out. But again, like the mechanic, you need bad reviews to build that clout. It is part of the process. So what should the future look like? Which is just me completely thinking out loud. Before we hop into that, Chris, I'll pause again for anything in the chat.
So some really interesting questions did come in. Yes. John writes, does the science communicator not get some street cred by writing about what the scientists have published if the scientist has some street cred of their own?
Oh, right. All right. So we're talking about like a transfer, a clout transfer. I think it, yes, right. Like as science journalists, for example, obviously have their own versions of earned clout too. Just speaking up to Ed Young, right? Anything Ed Young publishes right now is sermon to me, because I just trust that they will go out and find the sources and publish the work in a way that I can enjoy reading, even though it's about topics that are terrifying at the moment. So yes, yeah, there's different ways of earning clout. Again, a mechanic versus a scientist versus a journalist. But the idea here is that that wheel is constantly turning, and there is a regular output of information so that people can grant you that clout as you go, along in time.
Right. So the scientist who does the work that Ed writes about gets clout.
Yeah.
Ed wrote about it and brought publicity to the work, which can elevate it. At the same time, Ed gets clout for the writing and the sharing of it.
Right.
And both of those things come up. Maybe less so than like a communicator hitching their star to somebody else's train, or however that saying goes.
I want to be on that train. Huh? Where's that going? Yeah, and I always tell, to go off to a little bit of advice, I always tell scientists, if an article comes out that talks about you or cites your work, be part of that conversation, talk about what you talked about. And I know it seems a little bit redundant, but again, that helps it helps people make those connections between you and that topic. And the more connections that they regularly see, like, oh, I heard about elephants again, and I keep hearing this name. Like every time there's an article about elephants, it's this person, this person, this person. People start to put together that, yeah, if I have a question, if there's an elephant crisis coming up, this is actually the person I want to talk to about it.
All right. Another good comment came in from Randy. Is mixing in the red paint to communicate science enough to combat the misinformation and disinformation by many media sources, intentional or otherwise, on both sides of the political spectrum?
Right. Yeah, great question. So I think one of the largest criticisms about these unprecedented times has been a real lack of a communication campaign. And that is where we keep messing up a lot of these issues. Misinformation is a oiled star machine, the train is well oiled. There is a campaign there is a strategy. And the unfortunate thing is that, oftentimes the people in charge of disseminating a lot of this information think that they can just say it once, or they think that we can make this one message and everybody will understand it, and that's our work done. That's not how it works. And there's actually a lot that science communicators, big C science communicators can learn from a lot of these misinformation campaigns and the way that they are so viral, the way that they do take off. The answer to those miscommunication campaigns is not just saying one message and saying it, 3 times and then going, oh, the misinformation, being done with it. I would have liked to see personally when we had a recent crisis and when we move forward with different crises we're going to have, that there is a huge investment in how those messages with the science get communicated, that there are multiple messages from multiple communities, that it is a campaign off the bat. It's not waiting for problems or problematic voices to rise up. It's got to come first. Doesn't mean that the misinformation won't exist. It will. But then they're just a drop in the bucket versus, a huge campaign of mixing together this information.
Absolutely. You got time for one more?
Yeah, sure. What time are we at? Oh, yeah, sure.
Excellent. We've got a viewer, they say that their issue in thinking about social media is the anonymous nature of comments compared to radio, which wouldn't have been, as an example. Yeah,
so like anonymous is in, I'm gonna just take it and run with it. Like an anonymous is in, you can create a fake profile and post things out, sure. I would argue that those things could also happen on radio though, you could easily call in, I'm thinking now my version of radio, but you could easily call in and claim to be somebody else. There are, certain kind of way out there radio hosts right now who you never really see who they are or what they do. So yes, that can be a problem. And I think what's the worst part about those types of situations is what that indicates to me is that there's not, that niche hasn't been filled yet. If we're going to talk about it in like ecological terms, there's a niche there that's just not, there's not a dominant player or players in it from the scientific community, which allows these kind of voices to take over it. So yeah, it's a problematic thing. It's going to happen. And I think, again, going back to the point I was making before, our communications campaigns need to account for that instead of just wishing that they weren't there. They're going to be there. But how can you take it on, or how can you even, the best thing to do is bring in those voices and talk to folks, which I know a lot of people go, no, you don't want to, but really it's a skill that I think that again, I could go on, but we can really, really work on it, and not to ignore the fact that problematic outlets, people, anonymous posting, it's going to happen. So how do we take it on instead of currently burying our heads in the sand about it?
Yeah. And Max writes, that's a really good point, because mis and disinformation is absolutely learning from and appropriating and using lessons from science communication.
Oh yeah, totally. It is an arms race. Definitely. All right. We're going to have, this is a short section, and then we'll have a nice little discussion afterwards. So please keep your stream of conscious going. We're coming up to 9 minutes here. Wow. Okay. So the future. What does it hold? What should we start preparing? What should we be thinking about? And this is totally IMO. Here's what I think with this career I've had in science communication, where we can start. Number one, we absolutely know that the future is going to be more unstable and uncertain. So we also know that there's about to be tons more knowledge hitting us. Science is better. Science is way more advanced. Data is more real time. And we need to be able to incorporate that knowledge faster. An article in Science just published on Monday detailed how children born this year in 2021 will experience 7 times as many heat waves, twice as many droughts and crop failures, and twice as many river floods as their grandparents did. Today, like I've said before, today is actually the least unprecedented time that we can expect to have probably in the next 100 years. So we know this is coming. That's an absolute. Number 2, we know, we can see it again as platforms diversify and platforms splinter off. We're up to what now, 8 different types of social media. Communities are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller and way, way, way more niche. So we will need more science communicators, more mixers that have built clout in these communities, if we hope to be able to spread new knowledge quickly during a time of crises that we know are going to come. We know that there's a hunger for science to become less of a top-down process and more democratized. So number 3, I also argue, that we need to invest in knowledge infrastructure. We have to do that now. And I realize I'm completely preaching to the choir right now, but every community should have an easily accessible science center that you can walk to, that's easy to get to. We do a good job in the Triangle. This is not the case everywhere else. And that should be a place where people can go for the latest news and research, a place where people can go submit data or collect tools and equipment to collect their own data, a place that community members can come together and brainstorm community research that are important to them. Spread out this collection of information, let people be a part of the process so people will respect that process when it comes to these crises that we know are going to come. Science communicators need to be able to communicate all the sciences that are happening regularly, therefore building that clout, letting that wheel turn, so that when their crisis hits, and we'll have a respected expertise to turn to. We already know, when I want to know about this, I speak to this person. And absolutely, they need support when their detractors and the misinformation strikes, but they need to be a team of them out in the forefront of it as well. And lastly, here's my last slide. As part of investing into this infrastructure, we need to increase the creative forms of expression. There will be new social media platforms. There will be new rules. There will be, things that we can't even imagine in the future. And science communicators have to have the means to adapt to those changes quickly and efficiently. So again, part of this knowledge infrastructure, we need to be able to take it in and collect it and work on it as a team, but then we also need to be able to disseminate it and adapt to those changing landscapes and platforms as they come up as well. And that is my soapbox.
Everybody, wherever you're at, let's give Michelle a great big round of applause. You can drop your appreciations and clapping hands emojis into the chat box.
Thank you.
For Michelle to say thanks. Fascinating, very thought-provoking stuff here. And it has definitely provoked more thoughts. So maybe in the time we've got left, I can let you know what the folks over here are talking about.
Yeah.
Because Cindy writes, because we're talking about the future, right? And like the data you just shared, we're talking climate change. Like that's the big thing that we're looking at right now.
Right.
Cindy writes, Catherine Hayhoe, the climate scientist, says, I hope I said Catherine's last name right. The climate scientist says we need to communicate science with our heart and not just our head. Is communicating about climate change different than other types of science?
I mean, no. I mean, I would like, Catherine Hayhoe is like, again, another one of those, oh, Catherine Hayhoe, for me, 100%. And that goes back to that difference between the academic style and the science communication style. It's subjective. And part of the subjectivity of it, and I've written an article about this in the past, is it's actually more of a vulnerable process because you are including more of your heart. You are including more of your emotion, and you're making those direct connections between you, the researcher, and the audience who's impacted by that research, which means you just can't reproduce it. It's something that can happen one time. Even if I gave this talk again, I'm not going to be able to do it exactly the same again. So absolutely, I think all science communication should follow that. And that's a perfect way, of course, that Catherine Hayhoe put it.
Will writes, bouncing off Cindy, how do you approach Cycom that challenges a person's worldview?
Yeah, I've been there and done that. I always approach communicating when it comes to the type of conflict, I use that term loosely, approaching it with curiosity and not judgment. Looking at, tell me more about, tell me why, give me some more information about that. And I would say 80% of the time, unfortunately, that shuts down the conversation because a lot of people just, especially online, they just don't want to. But a solid 20% of the time, you do get to engage in a conversation. And that's a huge win to me. Again, we've got to be reasonable in what our goals are when it comes to having these types of conversations. I like part of the reputation that I want to keep going forward is that when people approach me with something that, maybe they're telling me that I'm likely a communist, right? As Rachel Carson was told, that I will always take that on to say, tell me more, give me some more information about this. Let's have a conversation about it. That's the goal that I have. The goal I don't have is being able to have a conversation with 100% of the people who reach out like that, or being able to completely change the hearts and minds of someone who has that type of idea. I think it was actually, I was watching a talk by, was it Matt? Maybe it was Matt Cosi, but he was saying that, or somebody was, sorry, whoever I'm giving credit to, it's important to still try and have those conversations because you might be the third person, right? The 10th, it might take the 10th person to have this conversation with that person before their mind is actually changed. So you do want to still be that link in that chain in order to be able to help somebody start to change their worldview on something. It doesn't happen in one conversation. It doesn't happen overnight.
Excellent advice. Let's see. Related, how do we prevent people from just withdrawing to their echo chambers where they just listen to opinions and quote facts that they're comfortable with?
Yeah, that is super tough. And again, what's the goal here? What are we setting up, right? Is it that we're going to reach every single pocket of everything and be able to completely change somebody's mind? The answer is no. My argument is that, to go back to the analogy I was using before, we need different mixers in different areas. We need to have different mixers in different communities. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to reach every community. Unfortunately, it's just not the case. So it is tough that when one of the arguments with social media versus the radio is that the radio was, you just turned it on and you could be involved in that conversation. But now you have situations where you have blocked groups, that you can't get access to unless what have you. It can get a little bit more challenging. in my experience, usually those people stay in the echo chamber for a while, and then they will start coming out to find you. And again, that's where I just stick with, okay, I'm maybe the first link in this chain of them getting different information, and stick with it. But yeah, I hear you. That's a huge challenge.
Let's see. Carl Bates in the chat made note that your examples of good science communication spaces heavily reflected Raleigh, North Carolina. But I would note to Carl that I think the other two locations were in Durham County.
Yes.
Not Wake County.
Carl.
So that's for you, Carl.
Faux pas.
And then let's see. The last thing I see here, what resources can you provide to follow up for other good science communicators?
Oh my gosh. Listen, there are so many great, I can, like, I'll come into the chats and like throw some links at you, if that's something that you'd like. But we've thrown around a lot of different names here. Catherine Hayo is a great one when it comes to climate communications. I'm lucky, I think we in general, if you're tuning in from the Triangle, we're really lucky with the expertise that's here, because we have so many people who are so keen to get out into the spaces and talk to different communities about the research that they're doing. But yeah, to name something just right off the bat, my head is flooded with different books and articles, but I'll just go ahead and throw some links in the chat when I've got some time.
Excellent. That sounds good. Or, hey, folks, if you're on Twitter, you can follow Michelle at the Sharkologist. And Michelle, maybe that would be a great place. You could drop some stuff.
Absolutely.
And people could go and reference.
Yeah, definitely.
Because then they come find you on Twitter too, which is good for everybody. Or you can share those with the Office of Environmental Education. They can post those and get those sent out as well. And we can continue this really awesome conversation.
Definitely.
Michelle, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you everybody who tuned in as well. I love giving these talks. So yeah, very grateful to join you this afternoon or evening or wherever it is where you're tuning in from. So thanks so much.
All right, everybody. That's going to be our show for today. From wherever you are watching all around the world, thanks for tuning in to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. We will be back here next Wednesday at noon with another great presentation for you. I'm sure it'll be something interesting and something you'll want to learn about. So make sure you're following the Office of Environmental Education on Twitter. They're at North Carolina EE, and you can check out their website to sign up for the email newsletter that's part of this series at eenorthcarolina.org. And of course, always make sure you're following the Museum of Natural Sciences. There's great stuff online coming out from us all the time. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel right here. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. We're at Natural Sciences on all major platforms, except TikTok, I guess, is a major platform now. I've just learned from Michelle. And I hope that we'll see you again here real soon. So, hey, from everybody here at the museum, take care, stay safe, keep your community safe. Have a great rest of your Wednesday. Bye, everybody.